To review part 1, I explained that in 1999 I was shocked to discover a proof that the idea of dichotomous afterlife is irrational. And in rereading the Gospels, I was shocked to discover that in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, except for a few anomalous statements, Jesus does not teach salvation by grace, but salvation by works. What next? What came next is that I could see that the conventional dating model for the synoptic Gospels is untenable. To explain this, I've got to refer to a few approximate years. Jesus died about the year 30. Paul's ministry was from the mid-40s to the mid-60s. The Romans destroyed the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. And under the conventional dating model, the Gospels were written after about the year 70. Now I'd like you to imagine the following. You're a devout Christian living in the year 70, and you've decided to write a gospel about Jesus. The Apostle Paul, who had been beheaded by Nero a few years earlier, had taught salvation by grace. There had been a meeting in Jerusalem about 20 years earlier, in the year 50, when Paul had argued that you don't have to keep the Jewish law to gain salvation. And Paul's argument had carried the day. By now, 20 years later, Paul's teaching had become the dominant Christian teaching, especially among non-Jews. And now you're going to write a gospel about Jesus. What are you going to say about how to obtain salvation? I invite you to pause the video at the next slide and answer the question. Let's put it this way. With Paul's teaching about salvation by grace dominant, are you going to write a gospel that portrays Jesus as teaching salvation by works? Not in your life. No one would want to hear such a message, except for Jewish Christians who are still clinging to the Jewish law. Please keep in mind that you're not a historian living in the 2000s, trying to accurately portray past events, no matter what they may be. You're a devout Christian who wants people to understand the good news of how to obtain salvation from hell through the death and resurrection of Jesus. So there's no way that you could bring yourself to write a gospel in which Jesus could be understood as teaching salvation by works. Rather, you've got to write a gospel that will make the way of salvation clear, so that people will know that salvation is by grace through faith. So what do you write? You write the Gospel of John. But you sure don't write Mark, Matthew, and Luke. This is why, to this very day, an evangelist will refer a person who is inquiring about the Christian faith to the Gospel of John. Now let's return to our life here in 2009. We've just seen that it's untenable to propose that the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, were written well after Paul's ministry, because in those Gospels, Jesus is portrayed as teaching salvation by works, and this message diametrically opposes Paul's teaching, which had become dominant by the year 70. As I also mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is not portrayed as God incarnate, but merely as the Son of God. And this is another reason that the Synoptics cannot be dated late. In light of these observations, we're forced to conclude that because Mark, Matthew, and Luke portray Jesus as teaching salvation by works, these Gospels must have been written before Paul's message of salvation by grace had become dominant. Complementing this observation, we conclude that because Mark, Matthew, and Luke portray Jesus as a Son of God rather than as God incarnate, they must have been written before Paul's message of divine incarnation had become dominant. Put simply, we're forced to conclude that the Synoptic Gospels were written early. This insight came to me as a result of rereading the Gospels and noticing that the Synoptic Gospels teach salvation by works and that they portray Jesus as merely a Son of God. Finally, if the Synoptic Gospels were written early, then we can conclude that they are highly reliable as compared to their reliability if they were written after about the year 70. But keep in mind that there are a few statements and passages in the synoptic gospels that are incongruent with the bulk of the material, and these must be carefully analyzed and dated accordingly. Having said that, I wish to mention that there are a few anomalous statements in the synoptics that must be accounted for. In my book, I go into immense detail on this topic, analyzing the content of the synoptic gospels and dating them accordingly. In my book, I also present 2 timeline figures to help explain this early dating model. I should say that I can't present all of this material in the abridged version of my book, but I present enough so that you can see that I've developed the model with painstaking attention to detail in modern scholarship. And I do include the 2 timeline figures in the abridged version. I wish to include 2 examples of anomalies from my book, and these examples are in the abridged version. If you're familiar with the synoptic gospels, you realize that in those gospels Jesus makes a number of statements that so blatantly contradict the idea of salvation by grace, they leave the modern Christian stunned and without a rational explanation. But once we realize that Jesus taught salvation by works, not salvation by grace, these statements of Jesus are no longer anomalous because they are consistent with the idea of salvation by works. One such statement is where Jesus identifies an unforgivable sin. Under salvation by grace, there can be no such thing as an unforgivable sin, because Jesus died to save us from all of our sins, no matter how horrendous. In fact, it would be blasphemy to claim that some sin was so horrendous that the death of Jesus, God incarnate, was an insufficient sacrifice to cover that sin. However, under salvation by works, there can be an unforgivable sin, a sin that is so horrendous that nothing else you could do or say could compensate for it and bring you salvation. In case you wish to look up the verses, here are the references along with a website where you can look them up in many different translations. The other example of interest consists of a set of statements in which Jesus explicitly communicates uncertainty about salvation. Here's an example in Matthew 7:21-23 in the New International Version. This is Jesus. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" Jesus says that you could perform miracles in his name and still be an evildoer headed for hell. This theme is obviously not salvation by grace, because under salvation by grace, if Jesus endows you with the power of miracles, you're obviously one of the saved. Rather, this is an assertion of a severe form of salvation by works that is designed to leave the listener with an utterly profound sense of uncertainty about their salvation. Again, in case you wish to look up the verses, here are the references along with a website where you can look them up